All right, so we're going to be going over the first part of the Unit 6 test review. So in the first question here, it wants us to write an equation for our graph, and we're first going to want to find out our amplitude. We're also going to figure out the midline, and then also we want to see if this is a sine or a cosine graph. So let's start with our midline. Our midline is in between our minimum and maximum values. So in this case, our midline is going to be at y equals 0. So that means we have no phase shift going on. The next thing we're going to figure out from that is going to be our amplitude. And that's just from our midline to our highest or our lowest value. In this case, it's going to be 3. Then, whether it's a sine or a cosine, at our y-axis, it starts at our minimum value down here. So that means it's going to be a cosine, again, because cosines start at our minimum or maximum value, and then sines will always start at our midline. So it's going to be cosine. And then lastly, we want to figure out what the period is. So our period is going to be from either a high point to a high point or a low point to a low point, or just one full cycle, as that's what its actual definition is. And here it takes pi to complete one cycle, and we'll come back to that in a second to figure out what our b value is. So again, we know this is going to be y is equal to, we have our amplitude, which is 3, and we know it is a cosine. Now, because this is a cosine that's starting at the bottom, usually cosines start at the high value, but since it's starting at our lowest value, it's going to be a -3. And so actually, I'll just erase that because I don't like how it looks. It'll be a -3 cosine. And now we're going to do our b value. And we get our b value because our period will be equal to 2 pi divided by b. And so if I just go ahead and I solve for b, so I multiply both sides of b by b divided by pi, that's the same thing as 2 pi divided by pi is equal to b. My pi's will cancel out, so 2 is equal to b. So it'll be 2 times x. And then again, we said we have no phase shift going on here, or we have no vertical shift. So therefore, all my equation is going to be is y is equal to -3 cosine of 2x. We will then go ahead and move on to our second question here, which is just asking us to determine the amplitude. So I just again have to find first my midline, which is halfway between my highest and lowest values, halfway between -1 and -7. That will be -4. We can get that by also just doing our highest value, which is -1, plus our lowest value, -7, divide that by 2, -8 over 2 equals -4. And then again, just like in the previous question, we are going from our highest value to our midline or our lowest value to our midline. It will be the same thing. So that's going to be 3 units there. So that means my amplitude, or my A, is going to be equal to 3. Okay, moving on to question number 3. This one's asking us for the range of the function y is equal to -2 cosine x. So if I was to just draw a general sketch of this graph right here, I know it's a cosine and it's a negative, so it's going to be starting at my lowest value. Again, I have no vertical shift, so that means my midline is going to be at y equals 0, and then my amplitude is 2, so it's going to be a -2. So starting down here, and then my highest value for my midline will also be 2, so it's going up 2 from our midline, which will be a +2. So if I go ahead and I make a cosine graph, just a sketch for that, it'll go low to middle to high to middle to low. So we can also keep continuing this trend here, and it'll be the same thing over and over again. Again, this is a pretty bad sketch, but it's still a sketch nonetheless. My lowest possible value I'm going to have is going to be -2. and then my highest value it can possibly have is going to be a positive 2, so we can either write it as negative 2 to 2 in brackets, or we can write negative 2 is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to 2, because again, those are the lowest possible and highest possible values of our function. And again, we get that by adding and subtracting 2 from our midline. The negative 2 in the front just tells us, the negative at least, just tells us that we're just going to be starting at the lowest point for our cosine instead of the highest point. If it was a positive 2, it would still be the same exact thing. Okay, this one here is asking us for the period of our graph. So this one, again, just is kind of just like question number 1. We just have to figure out how long it is a period. We don't even have to find our b value for this one. So I'm going to go from a high value here to a high value here. That just tells us 4 pi. So my period is just going to be equal to 4 pi. Now, in a case if it did ask us to determine what our b value is, then we would just go ahead just like our previous question. 2 pi divided by b is going to be equal to 4 pi. Then we switch out the b and the 4 pi, so we'll have 2 pi divided by 4 pi equals b. So that means b will be equal to 2 over 4, which simplifies down to 1/2. Number 5, it's asking us for an equation that would allow us to find the value of x on our triangle shown. So we have our angle here, 35. We'll consider that as our theta. And then we have an angle here, or a side here, which is opposite of it. And then we also have x, which is going to be our hypotenuse because it's across my right angle. So that's my hypotenuse. So which one of our sine, cosine, or tangent, which of our trig identities uses our opposite and a hypotenuse? That would be sine. So we go ahead and we set this up as sine of 35 degrees is equal to our opposite divided by our hypotenuse. So that would be 23 divided by x. And so if we were to go ahead and solve this for x here, I'd multiply both sides by x and then divide both sides by 35 afterwards. So then essentially I would end up with x is equal to 23 divided by sine 35. So that would be how we would find our x value there. Number 6, it's asking us now for the minimum value of y for our equation here. Just because we have this 2 plus in the front, we can just as easily move it to the back of our equation to be 5 cosine of x plus 2, which essentially is just saying that 2 right there, it just represents our vertical shift. So if our vertical shift is a plus 2, that means we're going up 2, which means we have a midline at y equals 2. So if I was to make a graph here, just a sketch again, it would be at 2. So that would be my midline. And then my amplitude tells me that we are 5 above that. So 5 above 2 is going to be at 7. So let's say that's up here at 7. And then my lowest value would be 5 below my midline, which 2 minus 5 would give me a negative 3. So my cosine, because cosine starts at the highest value, would look something like this. And so this question again is just asking us for our minimum value of y. So I'm looking for my lowest value. And as we said earlier, our lowest value we can hit is going to be negative 3. So then it would be y would be equal to negative 3 would be my lowest value possible here. All right, moving on to the second page, we have a ladder is leaning against the wall. The angle of depression from the top of the ladder of a 10-meter ladder to where it meets the ground is 20 degrees. Write an equation that can be used to find exactly how far away from the base of the ladder, or how far away the base of the ladder is from the wall. So I have my wall here. Now I have my ladder. Looks cool. And the ladder is 10 meters, so 10. And my angle of depression, which is this angle here, is going to be x. Nope, actually it's not going to be x. It's 20. I'll do it in a different color. This right here will be 20 degrees. And then it's asking us how far away it is the base of the wall from our ladder. So that would be our x down here. So we can go ahead and use what we know about alternate interior angles, or we can also just go ahead and say that this height here will also be 10, not 10. This wall will also be the same wall here, which means that distance here is going to be x. Either way it works, doesn't make a difference. But just for the sake of simplicity here, I'm going to say that this angle here is also 20 degrees because of alternate interior angles. So what can I use to find this x? I have this angle here, I have an adjacent side, and I also have my hypotenuse, so then I would go ahead and use cosine. So I will have cosine of 20 is going to be equal to my adjacent, which is x divided by 10. And to solve for x, I just multiply both sides by 10. So I will have 10 cosine of 20 is equal to x. Again, I feel like I didn't do a great job explaining that one, so I'll kind of erase this and draw a better diagram here. I'm still going to keep the answer there. So if I have this wall here, we don't know what that wall is, and we'll say this is our ladder, and this is our angle of depression. We know this right here is 20 degrees, but we also know here that this ladder is going to be 10 meters. And it's asking us to find our side right here. This forms an alternate interior angle here because we have a right angle, and that means that will also be a right angle there. When they add those together, it's complementary. So that means this angle will also be equal to 20 degrees. So then I'm just going to be using my adjacent side here, and then my hypotenuse. And again, we use cosine for adjacent over hypotenuse. So that's how we get cosine of 20 equaling x divided by 10, and then we multiply both sides by 10 to get 10 cosine 20 is equal to x. Number 8, we are just identifying transformation rules to our sine and cosine functions here. This time it's a cosine function. Our amplitude is always this number on the outside here, which in this case is 2. So a is equal to 2. Not much going on there. This question is asking us for the value of tangent c. C is going to be this angle, so I'll say it's theta, and tangent theta will always be equal to our opposite, opposite divided by adjacent. So our opposite side here from this angle is 24, and my adjacent is 10 because it's right next to it. So that's going to be equal, so tangent theta is going to be equal to opposite, which is 24, divided by adjacent, which is 10. And I can simplify 24 over 10. 24 over 10 simplifies down to 12 over 5. So essentially, I'm just looking for 12 over 5 here. That's all we have. And then lastly, number 10, this closes out our first part here. It's asking us to write an equation. So starting and ending the same way. I want to figure out A, is this a sine or a cosine? B, what's my amplitude? C, what's my midline? And D, my vertical shift. Let's start with our midline here. It's conveniently given to us here because it's where this ends on both ends. But if it didn't, we could do 2 plus -4 and divide that by 2, which is going to be -1. So my midline is going to be at y equals -1. And we can see it starts right here at our midline. So that means this is going to be a sine function. And then it goes up after, so it's going to be a positive sign. Then I can figure out what my amplitude is. So my amplitude is going to be, from my midline to my lowest value, or from my midline to my highest value, or my midline to my lowest value, either way. So it's going to be 3 for this one. And then lastly, I'm going to figure out my period, or one time it takes for it to complete one cycle. So if I follow my midline from where we go here to where we are here, this is the distance of pi. So now I'm going to use that in a bit to go ahead and find my b value. So again, because we know it's a sine, it'll be y is equal to 3, my amplitude, times sine. Again, it's a positive sign, so we don't have to worry about putting a negative in the front. Then we have our period, so we have to get our b value. So 2 pi divided by b is equal to pi. Switch those out, so 2 pi divided by pi equals b. So 2 will be equal to b. So 2x, and then plus my vertical shift. Technically, we're going to be subtracting here because the fact we're going down 1, so minus 1. So the equation for this graph here would be y is equal to 3 times sine of 2x minus 1. And that wraps up the first half of our Unit 6 test review.